the first time I saw my mother's handwriting in a bookstore. She'd already been dead for 3 years. It was a Saturday, the kind of bright, thoughtless morning when people stand in line for coffee and talk about the weather. I was doing the same until I saw it. A glossy cover propped up in the window, Home Fires, Recipes from the Heart by Aunt Celia Reade. Her name was written in curling gold letters, but the handwriting inside, that was my mother's. I knew it instantly. The slant of the L's, the long-tailed Y's, the tiny hearts she used instead of dots over her eyes when she was feeling playful. Celia never wrote like that. Celia's writing had always been sharp, upright, impatient. My mother's was round and soft like her. I remember standing there for a long time, my breath fogging the glass. People brushed past me laughing, carrying their bags of pastries and coffee cups, but I couldn't move. It was like seeing her ghost. When I finally went inside and opened the book, it wasn't just her handwriting. It was her. The recipes had her voice, the kind of gentle, practical instructions only she used. Don't forget to stir clockwise. Counterclockwise will make the sauce sulk. Add salt until it tastes like memory. No one else would write that. But there it was, under Celia's name. Growing up, Celia and my mother had shared the same kitchen, the same spice rack, the same family gatherings where food was the language that patched over everything left unsaid. My mother cooked like she was telling stories. Slow, deliberate, each dish a conversation between her and whoever was eating. Celia cooked for applause. When my mother died, she left behind a tattered green notebook filled with her recipes. The pages smelled like nutmeg and smoke, the edges worn from decades of being touched by hands that measured everything by feel. I thought I'd lost it during the move after the funeral. I tore apart every box, every drawer. Nothing. Now I knew where it had gone. Celia's restaurant, The Hearth, was only 10 blocks from my apartment. I'd avoided it since it opened, because even the smell of it made something in my stomach twist. But that day, I went. It was almost noon when I walked in. The place was full. Polished wood, brass lamps, the clatter of cutlery and soft music playing. And there she was, in the corner, signing copies of the book. "Aunt Celia," I said. She looked up, blinking in polite confusion that melted into a smile. "Darling, what a surprise. I didn't know you still lived in town." "I do," I said. "I saw your book." Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes flickered. "Ah, yes, you saw it. You used her recipes." Her tone turned careful, the way people talk to a child holding something sharp. "She'd have wanted them shared. They were too good to stay in a drawer." "She didn't write them for you," I said. "Sweetheart," she said, still smiling, "she wrote them for everyone." I wanted to shout, but the words caught behind my teeth. Around us, people were eating, laughing, tasting, living. No one cared that the flavors on their plates were stolen ghosts. That night, I bought the book. Not out of support, out of proof. I went home, cleared my table, and laid it beside the old family photographs I kept in a shoebox. My mother stirring soup, my mother laughing over flour-dusted counters, my mother teaching me to taste with my eyes closed. I opened the book and began to read. By midnight, I'd found 27 recipes copied word for word from her green notebook. Even her small personal notes were there. Places where she'd written things like, "Never cook angry." The stew will know. Celia hadn't even bothered to change them. I didn't sleep that night. I cooked. I made her chicken soup first, the one she always made when I was sick. As it simmered, the smell filled the room, rich and deep, like warmth itself. For a moment, I could almost believe she was there again, humming softly to herself, her back turned, her hair tied up with that old blue ribbon. When I tasted it, I cried. Not because of the flavor, it was perfect, but because it felt like opening a wound that never healed right. That's when I decided, if Celia could take her recipes, then I could take them back, not through lawsuits or confrontations. Through fire and flavor, I was going to cook every single recipe in that book, my mother's book, and serve them under my own name. Not in a restaurant, not in some polished space with linen napkins, but in a food truck, small and loud and alive. The way her kitchen used to be. I didn't have much. My savings were barely enough to buy a used truck, but I found one. Rusty, dented, cheap. It smelled like oil and cigarettes and lost dreams. Perfect. I painted it myself. Pale green. The same color as my mother's notebook. On the side, I stenciled the name in white letters, Marjorie's Kitchen. It wasn't her full name, just her first. Enough to whisper her back into the world. The first morning I opened, it was raining. The street outside the hearth glistened like silver. I parked right across from Celia's restaurant. When she stepped outside to see what the commotion was, she froze. Across the street, my truck gleamed under the gray sky, its small window open, steam rising. The smell of my mother's soup drifting across the road like memory itself. Celia's smile faltered for the first time in years. She didn't come over. She didn't need to. The first customers came by noon. A group of workers from the construction site nearby, drawn by the smell. I handed them bowls through the window, each one topped with fresh herbs, exactly the way my mother used to do. When they tasted it, one of them said, "Damn, this tastes like home." I smiled. That's the idea. By evening, I was sold out. I sat inside the truck, the windows fogged, my hands shaking from exhaustion. But it wasn't just fatigue. It was something sharper. For the first time since she died, I felt like I'd brought her back. Not through words or memories, but through the simple act of feeding people. And for the first time, Celia wasn't the one telling the story. I was. The next morning, I found a note taped to the truck's window. Cute idea, but you can't fight legacy with leftovers. CRI smiled, because she was wrong. You can't fight legacy with leftovers, but you can feed it to people until it becomes theirs again. The next morning, I arrived at the truck before sunrise. The streets were wet from last night's rain, and the city smelled of asphalt, exhaust, and coffee. I parked in my usual spot, directly across from Celia's restaurant. The awning was pulled back. The brass handles glimmered in the early light. Through the window, I could see her moving around the kitchen, polishing silverware, arranging menus like a general preparing her battalion. I poured coffee into a thermos, but my hand shook. Not from caffeine, but from anticipation. This wasn't just cooking anymore. It was strategy. She had opened the blinds and looked straight at me. I held her gaze from my truck's window, stirring the soup slowly, deliberately. The first customer arrived at 7, an old man who lived nearby. His hands shook as he took the bowl from me. He sniffed the aroma, closed his eyes, and muttered something under his breath. Just like my mother used to make it. I smiled politely. Word spread quickly. By 10 o'clock, a small line had formed. The aroma of simmering sauces, roasting meats, and fresh bread drifted across the street, sneaking into Celia's pristine dining room. I saw her pause. The polished knives in her hands froze midair. She adjusted the chef's jacket around her shoulders, frowning. Customers began leaving her restaurant. Slowly at first, a trickle, then a wave. People carried plates out, whispering to each other, leaning toward my truck, eyes wide, smiling with surprise. I heard one woman say, "I didn't think food could taste like someone, but it does." It was her voice, the memory of my mother's cooking, alive again in the mouths of strangers. Celia's smile had vanished. She moved through the kitchen like a shadow, her hands trembling as she adjusted silverware, but the smell had crossed the street. She couldn't contain it. I didn't gloat. I simply served. Every dish was my mother's. Every garnish, every stir, every pinch of salt was measured by memory, not by weight. I whispered her instructions under my breath, the way she had whispered them to me when I was a child. By lunchtime, the line stretched down the block. Celia's waitstaff peeked through the window, flustered, whispering to each other. The maitre d' came out and waved a hand toward my truck. I smiled at him politely. He scowled, muttered under his breath, and retreated. I didn't need to fight. The food did it for me. By late afternoon, I finally had a moment to breathe. I leaned against the truck's side, wiping my hands on a towel, and looked across the street. Celia had stepped outside. She was watching me from the sidewalk, arms crossed, the corners of her mouth tight. I waved. She didn't wave back. She just stared, calculating, plotting, like she always did. That's when I realized this wasn't going to be a single victory. It was a war. The next few days were a delicate battle of perception. Celia tried everything: new specials, celebrity endorsements, limited-time menus. But the people kept coming to my truck. Each dish was a reminder of authenticity, a memory of a home they didn't know they had lost. Each customer walked away whispering my mother's name, even though it wasn't on the menu. I watched them leave, satisfied. One evening, a letter was slipped under the truck's window. "Marjorie, this is clever. But cleverness fades. People will return to the comfort of fine dining." Sir, I held the note in my hands and smiled. "Cleverness fades," she said. Then I thought of my mother, in her kitchen, stirring a pot of tomato sauce, humming as she chopped onions. Her hands were sure even when mine shook beside hers. Her food never faded, and neither would I. That night, I began planning new dishes. Variations on old recipes, flavors that remembered but also surprised. Secrets my mother never wrote down. Small twists that made her spirit present, unmistakably hers, unmistakably mine. I realized something important. This was never about winning against Celia. It was about reclaiming memory. It was about serving justice one bowl at a time. By the end of the week, Celia's restaurant was quieter than ever. I watched her from the truck as she stepped onto the street, carrying a tray of leftovers to the dumpster. Her brow was furrowed, her shoulders tense. The pride in her posture was gone, replaced by exhaustion. Across the street, I lifted a steaming bowl to a customer's lips. The smile that spread across her face was all the satisfaction I needed. And for the first time since the book had been published, I felt my mother beside me. By the second week, I had established a rhythm: morning prep, midday service, evening cleanup. Every move measured, deliberate. Every dish served a story, every bite a whisper of memory. Celia, across the street, was no longer moving with confidence. She adjusted menus frantically, tried new specials, and even rearranged the layout of her tables. But the air still carried the aroma of my cooking. It lingered in corners, clung to clothes, entered noses like a ghost that wouldn't leave. I began experimenting. My mother's recipes were only the beginning. Hidden within them were little techniques, secrets she had never written down, taught only to me as a child. A pinch of smoked paprika in the bechamel, a slow caramelization that transformed onions into golden sweetness, a sprinkle of lemon zest that brightened the darkest sauces. I started to call them memory markers. They weren't meant to impress. They were meant to awaken recognition in those who had known my mother's kitchen, to spark nostalgia and loyalty. Word of mouth traveled faster than social media. Customers came not just for lunch, but to taste the flavors of childhood. People whispered about the food truck, carrying stories back to friends and colleagues. Lines formed earlier and grew longer with each passing day. Celia noticed. She came out one morning while I was serving. Her arms were crossed, her smile thin. "Marjorie," she said, "you've done well, but people will forget." "They already haven't," I said, wiping a spoon on the edge of a bowl. "And neither will they forget her." "You're overstepping," she said. "No," I replied. "I'm reclaiming." Her expression faltered. I could see it in the tightening of her jaw and the way her fingers gripped the menu. For the first time, she looked small, like someone who had lost control of a story she thought she owned. It wasn't just the taste, it was the narrative. Every dish reminded people who my mother was. Every aroma carried history, love, and care. And every customer who returned told their friends. One day, a woman approached the truck, tears in her eyes. "Your mother's chicken soup," she said. "It's exactly how she used to make it." I nodded. "I cook it for her memory." She hugged me, the kind of hug that carries decades of longing and grief. I let her hold on to me for a moment. Celia's restaurant lost another table that day. Then came the subtle sabotage, without a trace, without confrontation. I began to offer my customers small notes, little hints about ingredients that were deliberately unique, authentic, and impossible to replicate. I would see them later at Celia's place, frowning over dishes that were missing the magic my food provided. Celia started asking questions in the staff meetings, demanding to know why her customers were leaving mid-meal, why they were commenting about flavors that weren't on her menu. I smiled to myself. Revenge wasn't shouting. It wasn't stealing or yelling. It was quiet, invisible, effective. By the third week, she sent a server to the truck with a note. "Can we talk?" CRI didn't respond. Instead, I added a new special. My mother's apple tart with a hidden hint of cardamom. The same subtle spice she used only when she wanted to remind me that sweetness could exist even in bitterness. The people came, lined up, tasted it, smiled, whispered, and returned the next day. Celia watched from her window, helpless. She tried to mimic the flavors, adjust the techniques, but the subtlety, the essence of memory, was mine alone. It was poetic justice. One evening I closed early. The street was empty, wet from rain, reflecting neon signs in the puddles. Celia stepped out, holding a small notebook. "I want to understand," she said quietly. "Teach me one thing, one recipe." I looked at her, silent, letting the rain fall on both of us. "Memory isn't shared," I said. "It's inherited. But some things can't be stolen." Her shoulders sagged. She nodded slowly, understanding more than she would ever admit. I returned inside the truck, lit a small lantern, and prepared the last dish of the day. A simple broth, rich and golden, the kind that reminds people of home. Across the street, Celia watched silently. For the first time, she understood that she could never replicate what had been taken, and that was enough. Spring came slowly, teasing the city with sunlight and warm breezes. My food truck, once a small, tentative venture, had grown into a symbol of authenticity. People lined up not just for meals, but for connection, to taste, memory, and stories they thought were lost. Across the street, Celia's restaurant had changed too. Her polished composure was gone, replaced by careful calculation, hurried specials, and menus rewritten weekly. Yet her diners dwindled. They returned to the truck, drawn by the invisible thread of my mother's presence, woven into every dish. I had one last plan for revenge, though not through confrontation. It was subtler, more lasting, a banquet for the city, a celebration of my mother's life and recipes. I rented a small park square for one night. Lanterns hung from the trees, tables lined with white cloth, and I cooked with precision, love, and patience. Every recipe my mother had taught me, and some she hadn't, secrets only I knew, was served in bowls, on plates, and in the air itself. Celia received an invitation, of course, delivered by a courier. "You are welcome to witness the legacy. March 21st, 6 p.m., Hearth Square." She came, sharp and upright, her hands folded, expression unreadable. She watched quietly as the first guests arrived, as laughter, conversation, and delight filled the square. The aroma reached her before she took her first step onto the lawn. She froze. A faint recognition of smells, the cinnamon, the smoked paprika, the subtle zest of lemon, made her hands tremble. She understood finally that this was my mother's kitchen reborn. Not copied, not stolen, but lived. People tasted, they smiled, they cried. Old friends and strangers alike whispered the words my mother used to say, "Add salt until it tastes like memory." And with each serving, the truth became undeniable. The legacy was mine. Not because I had taken it, but because I had nurtured it, honored it, and shared it authentically. Celia watched it unfold like a spectator at a play she could no longer direct. For the first time, she was powerless. At the end of the night, the lanterns dimmed, the last bowls washed and put away. I walked across the square and stood beside her. "You see," I said quietly, "this is her memory. Not yours. Not stolen. Alive." Her lips parted, but no words came. She nodded faintly, eyes misted with something I could not name: regret, awe, or acknowledgement. "Perhaps all three. I understand," she whispered at last. "Good," I said. "Because some legacies aren't meant to be claimed. They're meant to be honored," I smiled gently. "And now, hers lives in every bowl, every taste, every memory people carry with them." She turned away, silently, no confrontation, no bitterness left to offer. She had seen that some things could not be taken, only nurtured, and I had nurtured every piece of my mother's spirit. When I returned to the food truck the next morning, parked quietly in my usual spot, the city felt softer. The air smelled of baked bread, fresh herbs, and possibilities. I opened the window and set out the first pot of soup. A line had already formed. Smiles, greetings, and the soft recognition of flavors filled the street. I served them quietly, deliberately, as my mother would have, and in every spoonful, her memory lived again, untouchable, alive, and fully reclaimed. I placed her green notebook beside the register, the pages worn, the handwriting round and perfect. I didn't need it to remind me of her anymore. I had lived her recipes, honored her secrets, and shared her essence with the world. The food truck, once a simple idea born from grief and anger, had become a vessel of love, memory, and slow justice. And in that quiet, delicious, unstoppable way, I had won.